attach, and the chromosomes line up in the middle of the cell. That would be metaphase. Sister chromatids separate from each other. Anaphase. Nuclear membrane breaks down. Prophase. And then 2 nuclear membranes form. Telophase. And of course, if we think in order, it would go prophase, metaphase. So hopefully you feel really comfortable with those stages of mitosis. We have one last kind of lecture discussion to do today on something called asexual reproduction versus sexual reproduction. So if you open up in your folder to where we recently left off, or if you look in the bottom, it's chapter 5, page 15. We'll see the heading asexual reproduction. So at the very beginning of this unit, we talked about the 3 reasons why cells need to divide, and one of those is reproduction. So there's actually 2 types of cell division. We'll talk about the other one later on in the year. It has some similarities and differences to mitosis, but again. So, have a couple of images up here on the board to compare what we call asexual versus asexual reproduction. You see this prefix A in front of a lot of words in biology, and it just usually means not or no. So it's either sexual reproduction or it's not. And so when we're talking about the differences between these 2 processes, you may already know that sexual reproduction requires 2 parents, but asexual reproduction only requires 1. So a lot of organisms do asexual reproduction, and so basically when they divide, make new cells through mitosis, they can end up making new organisms. So some examples of organisms that do that. All unicellular organisms are going to divide and reproduce asexually. A lot of more simpler eukaryotes, simpler animals can do it, and lots of plants can also reproduce asexually. And there's actually quite a few organisms that can do both. So sometimes they reproduce asexually, sometimes they reproduce sexually, depending on the situation. And another really important difference to know is that if we're dividing asexually, if we are going through mitosis to make new offspring, then those offspring are going to be exactly the same. Okay, basically clones. They're clones of each other. So anytime you have an organism that reproduces via mitosis, you're producing clones. Okay, your offspring are going to have exactly the same DNA. Because that's what happens when we go through mitosis, is we end up with 2 cells that have exactly the same DNA as each other and exactly the same DNA as the parent. So there's a couple questions there in your folder. First one is, what is the creation of offspring from only one parent organism called? And then number 2, so go ahead and make sure you answer those and talk about your responses with the group members. Same thing.
Yeah, it's talking about cost.
And when you're done talking over those questions, go ahead and pull out your computer and go to the Canvas calendar. I'll take a quick break from our folder. So once you get to the agenda, there's a link here that says link to sexual versus asexual reproduction interactive. And if you click on that, and it says living things use lots of different strategies for producing offspring, but most strategies fall neatly into the categories of either sexual or asexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction generates offspring that are genetically identical to a single parent. In sexual reproduction, two parents contribute genetic information to produce unique offspring. So these have the advantages and disadvantages, which we'll continue to talk about in a little bit. But just want to give you some time to kind of explore. There's a large variety of different organisms here. And so if you click on one, it'll give you a little paragraph alert to read. And then you have to decide what modes of reproduction it uses, either sexual, both, or asexual. And so I want to give you a little bit of time to look around at this. Try to find 3 organisms that fall under each category. So 3 organisms that do sexual, 3 that do asexual, 3 that do both. Spend a little bit more time on that if you need to, if you haven't found some organisms that do one or the other or both. But we're going to skip ahead a little bit in our folder to question number 6 through 8. So once you go ahead and discuss those questions with your group when everybody's ready. Okay. So let's talk about those as a class really quickly. So question number 6, that was almost the same as question number 2, just phrased slightly different. So if we have a eukaryotic organism, that means an animal or a plant or anything that has organelles, that has a nucleus. If they reproduce through mitosis, what's going to be true about the offspring? Yeah, and we have to keep in mind, like, environmental factors play a difference. So even if you're genetically identical, sometimes that doesn't necessarily mean you are like, physically identical. But yeah, genetically they're exactly the same, right? So again, they're clones of each other. As you were looking through all these animals, did you notice a pattern in what kind of organisms reproduce asexually? What do you think? Yeah, definitely any of the single-celled organisms, right? Yeast, bacteria, although they don't do mitosis, they do a slightly different process that we'll talk about in a second. These algae, amoeba. So anything single-celled is going to reproduce asexually. Did you notice any other categories that seem to, or what other organisms in here also can reproduce asexually? Yeah.
Organisms that can detach like body parts.
Yeah, anything that can regenerate. So, for example, the starfish here, right? That it could get split into, and it could grow. Each one could grow back into starfish. Anything else? Yeah. Yeah. So I don't know if they can. Oh yeah, they can do that process called parthenogenesis, where they can reproduce without a male. Yeah. So and a lot of fish can do that too. So a lot of fish, some insects, lizards. Another one that I saw anyways was there's quite a few plants that do this. So you can take clippings from plants, or like the strawberries or the redwoods here. They're talking about how the roots are up, the leaves that grew up from the roots. So a lot of plants can reproduce asexually that way too. Although they also have pollen and flowers, and a lot of them, or in this case, cones in pollination, so they can reproduce. Yeah.
If the roots stay connected, isn't it considered the same organism now?
Well, that is really that is a good question. I think because if you separate the roots, they can both still live on their own. So I don't know. I think that just kind of depends on how specific what your definition is. But again, technically you're like sprouting new trees from the root system. So I mean, we definitely have separate trees that are growing. So I think the strawberry was another example of that. But other plants don't, like the sunflower, that only reproduces sexually, so that you have to have pollen, has to be pollinated. I didn't check the cactus. Yeah, so they have a flower and pollen, so they reproduce technically sexually. Okay, they have two different parents. So I just think that is something interesting to take a look at. Question number 9. This is really blurry, but this is the life cycle of a sea anemone. So based on this diagram with your group members, go ahead and try and answer question number 9. What do you guys think? This would probably be a lot easier if all the words were blurry. So this is one of those examples where the organism can actually do both. So this here is kind of showing the cloning process where they're just mitotically splitting. And up here, here's an egg and a sperm from separate sea anemones that are then fertilizing and growing into a new sea anemone. So this is a case of an animal that actually does both. So they can divide mitotically and reproduce asexually, or they can create egg and sperm and reproduce sexually. With your group, let's take a look at the table on the same page but up above. I lost what number it was. Number 5. And before we look at a chart of these advantages and disadvantages, I want you to kind of brainstorm with each other, see if you can think of what some advantages and disadvantages of each one of those methods would be. Okay. So there might be more advantages and disadvantages, but here's the decent list to take a look at. So you can kind of see if any of your ideas are up here. So first of all, some advantages. Since you don't have to spend all the energy to find a mate, you don't have to spend extra energy in the reproduction process itself. Generally, you can tend to reproduce in a lot larger numbers. So if you reproduce asexually, you can generally make a lot more offspring than you would normally make otherwise. If your genes are really good, then all your offspring will also have those really good genes, and you could potentially then be able to outcompete other organisms, especially if you're growing really quickly, right? If your population's growing really quickly, then you might be able to outcompete other organisms that are competing in the same niche, that are using the same nutrients and resources. And then this is another like numbers advantage. You know, the more you have, the less likely you're going to be wiped out if a predator comes along or if some other condition, like a natural disaster happens, right? If you have lots of you, then you're less likely to get completely wiped out in one go. And then I know there's only 3 rows, but this takes a lot less energy. And I don't know, I like watching nature shows. I know not everybody does, but if you watch any nature documentary, it's like half of the time animals are worried about eating and getting eaten, and the other half of the time they're worried about reproducing, right? So you think about all the energy that a lot of organisms go through to attract a mate in order to reproduce. It takes a lot of energy. And in some cases, this isn't up here, but you're more likely to get, that's checking about disadvantages, sorry. We'll get to it. So it takes less energy. You can produce really large amounts in a short amount of time. And if your genes are good, then why fix something that's broken, right? If your genes allow you to survive really well in your environment, then you don't need to mix them up. You don't need to make new combinations of them. However, sometimes being genetically similar, being clones, can be a bad thing. So, for example, once you pick up a negative mutation, every time you divide, you're going to pass on that negative mutation to all your offspring, right? So, if you're a sexually reproducing organism like us, you're only going to pass on that mutation half the time, right? So, when you pass your DNA, you only pass half of it on. So if a mutation pops up in a organism that only reproduces asexually, then all of the offspring are also going to have that negative mutation. It mentions specifically in here that this can make these populations more susceptible to disease. So if you're all genetically the same, if there's a new disease that pops up, you're less likely to have the variation to fight it off. So large amounts can mean you're really good at interspecific competition, so you can outcompete other organisms. But if you have too many of the same organism in the same place, you're also going to have to compete. So sometimes if you're producing really large amounts of offspring in a close space, then they're just going to be competing against themselves. And then lastly, even though having a very large population might help you in some situations to survive, again, because you're all genetically the same, you don't necessarily have a wide range of tolerance if your environment changes. So those are some things that can be advantageous and disadvantageous as far as asexual reproduction goes, and why a lot of organisms don't reproduce that way. Or can be both. So they can have both advantages of both systems. thing we need to talk about is going back to number. Sorry, flip backwards to number 3 and 4. So we mentioned that a lot of single-celled organisms reproduce through mitosis. That's really, mitosis is a eukaryotic organism process. So we're only going to go through mitosis if you have lots of chromosomes. And that does not include bacteria. Okay, so bacteria, you might remember from last semester, are prokaryotes, which means they don't have a nucleus. Okay, so instead they just have this circular chromosome, like this. And so in order for bacteria to divide and reproduce, they just copy that circle, that circular DNA. So here you can see them duplicating it. And after they duplicate it, kind of like mitosis, one ring of DNA goes to one side of the cell, the other ring of DNA gets pulled to the other side of the cell. And then we just go through cytokinesis, right? The cell gets split. So hopefully you can see some similarities to mitosis, right? In both cases, we have to replicate the DNA. Both cells need a full copy. In both cases, we divide it evenly. So we pull one copy to one end, the other copy to the other end. And in both cases, we're going through cytokinesis. This is just a much simpler process for prokaryotes because they just have that one circular chromosome instead of a bunch of circular chromosomes or linear chromosomes like eukaryotes do. Now, I know you only have 3 boxes there, so you can maybe just do 1, 2, 3, or however you want to represent that so that you know what's happening. And then once you're good with that, last thing we need to do is discuss number 4 with your group members. When you're done sketching. Does anybody know what the word fission means? Yeah, to split apart. So binary fission, we're just splitting apart into 2 cells. Anybody have any questions over any of that material today? All right. So you have a decent chunk of time left. I think everybody in here got their PowerPoint turned in from yesterday. If you didn't, though, please make sure you at least have had one person from your group turn that in. And then what I'd like you to use the rest of the time to work on besides that is I have some review assignments for you. So I have these set up to be due Monday night. There's a multiple choice matching assignment, and then there's a written assignment. So this multiple choice matching, just like pretty much all my other teams, because you can take this as many times as you want. So this is really meant to kind of be your study guide for the unit. And then the written response, I usually just grade for completion, but that's just to give you an idea to practice writing some of the essay questions. There might be similar essay questions to that on the test. So take some time to start working on those. They're going to be officially due Monday night, and our test then is going to be on Tuesday. So we'll do some review on Monday. Back together again. Take some time to look at those and work on those assignments. Feel free to discuss them with your group members if you want to.